Okay, privacy and security. So this is the Digital Security for Journalism lecture. This is going to be taught at a bit of a higher level than I normally teach this thing. I do journalism training seminars for various places. We're also going to talk a little more about the broader question of privacy and user data. Obviously, this has become a very big field, you know, to the point where there's now congressional inquiries about consumer data privacy, which was not something you saw before last year. But really, the emphasis for us today is on trying to keep journalists safe. So this is how we're going to do this. We're going to start with some basics and just simple stuff. And as the keepers of the security knowledge, you will probably find yourself responsible for security practice at some point, simply because no one else will have studied how to do this. So I'm going to try to give you some tips for that. And then we're going to go through sort of various aspects of this, including the legal issues around it, or some of them. The highest level framework I'm going to teach you today is called threat modeling. Has anyone heard of this? So there's no one-size-fits-all security. You have to plan security for the particular context and the particular story that you're working on. And we're going to talk about how to do that. And then we're going to do some case studies. So as you may know, the WikiLeaks cables, the set of 250K diplomatic cables, were never meant to be fully released publicly. The news organizations who were working on them were vetting them and redacting them and releasing them a few at a time. But there was a monumental series of security mistakes which caused the entire archive to be leaked. And we're going to talk about that as a case study of how even experts get this stuff wrong. And unfortunately, we have lots of other case studies of security failures in journalism at this point. So the basics. So this is what I hope everybody in your news organization is doing. If you don't know who the security person is in your news organization, it's going to be you, unfortunately. There's starting to be a little more literacy about this stuff, but basically, if you can get proper passwords and proper logins, and you can teach people about phishing, you're 90% of the way there. Almost all actual attacks on journalists and their sources are through phishing. So if you can cut out that vector, you're doing pretty well. And then there's, you know, basic device encryption. That's getting a lot easier. Basically, everything is encrypted by default these days. And then there's the, you know, I forgot to turn off access problem. Passwords. I'm sure you've gotten this speech from a number of places, but every time there's a major password breach, we see something like this. This has gotten a little better. Most sites don't let you use password as a password anymore. They don't let you use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 anymore. But you can see, you know, everyone thinks they're being clever by using shadow and dragon as a password, but no. I also really enjoy how the LinkedIn passwords are raunchier than the Gawker passwords. I think that's that says something very interesting about our society. I'm not quite sure what, though. Anyway, as the saying goes, don't be that guy, right? So don't do that. The ever brilliant XKCD had a nice one on passwords a few years ago. Yeah, you can do all this, like replacing you know, letters with numbers and stuff. But passphrases are actually easier to remember and more secure, just in terms of the number of bits of information involved. But, you know, honestly, don't use a dictionary word or a variation on a dictionary word. is really the major piece of advice here. Why is that? What is the vulnerability of dictionary words? Yeah, there's not that many of them. There's maybe a few 100,000 when you start to look at variations and do this like digit substitution thing. But let's say less than 1 million. But why does that matter?
Someone could go to a lot of them.
Right. So you don't want someone to go through every word. Now, you can't go through every dictionary word trying to log into Facebook, or you can't go through every 6-digit passcode trying to log into your phone. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but eventually it starts slowing you down, and eventually it only lets you enter one passcode every 10 minutes. 10 minutes or 15 minutes, something like that. So most sites don't let you do millions of attempts. But there's still a problem. Anyone know what it is? Let's look at this again. How are users' passwords stored on disk? When someone broke into LinkedIn, did they actually find a file that had this in them? No. So how are passwords stored? Anyone know? Huh?
Like hashed.
Hashed, right, okay. So, and this is very old, right? This has been security practice since the 1970s. So if you go to your Unix system and you, generally these days you won't have read access to this, but you might if you're on a root system where it's not properly not secured. There's a file called etc password. And what that file looks like is it's a series of usernames and then a hash. Okay, and what that hash is we compute, we take some hash function and we hash the password. And the hash function is a one-way function. You've all seen hash functions. You've had some cryptography somewhere. Yeah, this is going to be the cryptography-heavy course in this class. Of course, the point of a hash is that it's very fast to compute this and very slow to invert it. This is why they're also sometimes called a one-way function. And so then when someone's trying to log in, you hash the password they type in and see if it matches the hash in the file. So good enough. And the point of this is that even if you can get this file, you can't figure out what the password is without a lot of computer power. The point of a hash function is that you can't do better than random guessing. Yeah.
But you could also like sort it by frequency, and then you'd know that the top hashes probably correspond to things like password.
That's one vulnerability. The other vulnerability is something called a rainbow table. And what a rainbow table is what you do is you take a file of English words, right? You get just a list of dictionary words, and you hash every single one of them. And so now you have a, let's say, 1,000,000 entry table, which is just a lookup from the hash to the original word. And that's what this is. That's how they got this, right? So you can hash 1,000,000 words on your GPU in, an hour or two. And you get a multi-gigabyte file, and then you're done. If you can get this file, you can invert all the passwords. Now, there are a bunch of ways to prevent this. One is that modern systems also use a salt, which is they pick some constant, and the constant is system specific. And what that does is it means that you have to generate a rainbow table for that system, which first of all slows you down. It means you can't just download a rainbow table. And also you have to know the salt constant, right? So it makes things a little harder. The other thing you can do is you can make this hash function super slow. So sometimes you see like multiple salts and multiple steps. If you can make that password calculation take half a second, you're never really going to notice it when you're logging in. I mean, what's half a second? But if you're trying to compute 1,000,000 of these, suddenly it takes weeks instead of days. So there are various things you can try to do to defend against rainbow tables, but the best thing you can do is not use dictionary words, which is why most systems don't allow it these days. Because then you can't invert these, right? Which means that even if someone breaks into your system and steals your password file, you're still not going to be able to figure it out, except that you can do the frequency trick. You can probably take the most common one and then guess, just start with a list of the most common passwords that people use when they have to put an uppercase letter, a symbol, and a digit in it. Anyway, point is, proper passwords will protect you against vulnerabilities in the system that is storing passwords. Probably more important than that, actually, is two-factor authentication. This used to be quite rare, but it's pretty common. As you know, Colombia switched to two-factor authentication this year. Thank goodness. As a journalist, and I'm going to say this many times, as a journalist, you are a target, okay? That means you need to be protecting yourself, and one of the very best ways to protect yourself is to turn on two-factor authentication on all your accounts, including, of course, your personal accounts, right? Even if there's nothing work-related in your personal account, if someone wants to harass you, getting into your email is a great way. So good passwords, good two-factor, or turn on two-factor. You can do this on all your social media accounts. Basically everything with a password these days supports two-factor authentication. There is no excuse for not using it. There's no excuse for your colleagues not using it. You're running at risk. The other problem you're going to have is if you use the same password for multiple sites, then if one of them is compromised, they're all compromised. I know for a fact that one of my passwords has been compromised because I still get notifications for, random sites I logged into 5 years ago, right? Just whatever site, and someone logged in. Is this you? At least use different passwords for your email and other things, because your email is used to reset every other password. So if you're only going to have 2 passwords, use one for email and another for everything else. But really, you should be using a password manager. 1Pass or LastPass or whatever it is that you want to use. Because you want a different password on every site so that when, not if, but when one site is compromised, you don't compromise all the other sites. All right, so that's login hygiene. Any questions? All right. Phishing. This is, as I mentioned, really important thing number 2. How many of you have heard of phishing? Just show of hands. Okay, so most of them. So phishing cannot be protected against by technical means, because it is not a technical attack. It is a confidence game. It's a trick, okay? The reason phishing works is because it tricks someone into doing something they shouldn't. For example, typing in their password into a fake login page. How can you tell if a login page is real or fake?
URL?
Yeah, look at the URL. Right? The browser designers have gone through an enormous amount of trouble to make it hard to fake a login page. Now I have a bunch of examples of journalists being hacked by phishing, journalists and their sources. So I think we discussed this tweet earlier. This is a famous tweet which briefly crashed the stock market. This was probably the, what did they call themselves? It was the Syrian cyber army. Anyways, Syrian government-affiliated hackers, which they attacked a bunch of news organizations around 2013. They defaced the front page of the New York Times for a few hours. They didn't do any serious damage, but they could have, potentially. And this is, we believe, how they got in. So notice here that the email came from a colleague. It appeared to come from someone else at AP to someone at AP. And how they did that was they first got into one account. So this is a classic trick, right? You compromise any account in the organization. So you send out this message to all 3,000 employees of the AP. You get one of them who falls for it, and now you have access to their account. Now, who knows what their job is, right? Maybe there's nothing interesting in their email, but now you can send an email from their account to a colleague, which makes it more likely that the person receiving the email will fall for it. So you can go step by step through increasing levels of trust this way. There's several ways this message is suspicious. How can you, what of this email could be suspicious?
It's not addressed to a person, like the salutation is the message text itself is very arbitrary.
Very general, yeah. And look at the subject line. News. It's the dumbest subject ever, right? There's nothing, it says nothing about what it actually is, right? Please read the following article. It's very important. It's, yeah. So there's another tell here as well, which is that if you hovered over this URL, it doesn't go to the Washington Post, right? So you all know that a link text and the link URL are two different parts in the HTML. So you can make a link that looks like, you just set the text to one thing and set the link to another thing. Right, so these should be red flags, right? It should be, if it's very generic, maybe you should think be a little more suspicious. And the easiest way to check your suspicions is to see where the link goes to. You may remember the hacks of the DNC in the 2016 election. We believe this is how they got into the DNC via John Podesta. And the interesting thing about this sad case is that the security person actually noticed it. Let me actually go to the original reference for this. Oh, because this story is pretty fascinating. All right, so somebody faked being Google, right? It said, please reset your password. And it had a change password link that went to bit.ly. So that should be a red flag for you, right? Because that would be google.com. And then Podesta was like, huh, this doesn't look right. And they sent it to the IP team. And we think there was one word problem here, right? This is a legitimate email as opposed to an illegitimate email. So this is good advice. Definitely needs to change the password immediately. But he clicked on the bit.ly link instead of this one. So there was some confusion, and I don't know if it's the IT person or if they had meant to type illegitimate. But there was some confusion. The IT person correctly recognized that there was a problem. Podesta correctly recognized that there was a problem. But then on the chain of communication back to Podesta didn't ensure to tell him not to click on the link, and so he clicked on the link. And that is why we know John Podesta's risotto recipe. I don't know if you saw that, that was in the links. So it's a sad story because it almost worked, right? More recently, last year, Citizen Lab, which is a research group at the University of Toronto, has been tracking the use of a piece of phone spyware called Pegasus. Pegasus is a pretty frightening piece of software. It is a commercial product sold by a company called NSO Security, I think, or NSO Group. It's an Israeli company, And what they do is they sell you a kit to infect phones. How it works is you send a text message to somebody with a link, and this works for both iPhone and Android. And if you click the link, it eventually installs the Pegasus spyware. This is a very sophisticated piece of software. It's very expensive to do what they've been doing. NSO Group, yeah. This is a slide which we believe is from the Pegasus documentation. It was from a bunch of leaked emails from NSO Group. So they got hacked, and this was in the hacked files, so this, probably authentic. But we do know from analysis of the spyware that it tries to drop that it can do things like turn on the microphone and camera of the phone. So if you click on this link, then your phone is spying on you and reporting back. So Citizen Lab has done this very sophisticated analysis of how this stuff works. Basically, how you do this type of analysis is you look for the command and control servers. When you click that link has to go somewhere. So that's at least one server. That in this work, that's called the front-end server that applies the exploit and downloads the spyware. And then it needs to report back. That's called the back-end server. It appears that generally those are two different machines. So it has to download the software from somewhere, and it has to send the exfiltrated data or the audio stream to somewhere else. So you can look for these servers because they have a particular signature on the internet when you connect to them. This was used in a bunch of places. The reason we know about this spyware is because enough journalists were aware of this problem to send the suspicious links. So in particular, yeah, it's the Mexican cases. This is super sad. Where is it?
6, I think it's Reckless 6, Mexican.
Reckless 4, yeah. Part 6, right?
Yeah.
Oh, these are even more. Jeez. Anyway, a bunch of there is a Mexican news organization that is reporting on narco cartels. Oh my God, there's even more of them here. Here we go. And interestingly, across a bunch of people, in one case what they did is there was a journalist who was killed. He was the publisher of a news organization. And then 2 days after his death, some of his colleagues were targeted with Pegasus spyware. So the message that they received actually said, we have information on who killed your colleague. So this is not just phishing, it's targeted phishing, what's sometimes called spear phishing. You craft a message that's designed to be interesting to the intended target. Unfortunately, the targets in this case forwarded the link to security organizations who eventually forwarded it to Citizen Lab, and Citizen Lab was able to do the testing to confirm that it was the Pegasus spyware. And it's great, right? Because if you get one of these links, if you go to that link, it tries to download the spyware. So so you can get a copy of the spyware, right? It really helps the investigators. Fortunately, things do seem to be improving. There have been lots of trainings in this part of the world to teach journalists to forward suspicious links to organizations who can help them. Interestingly, some of this stuff, a lot of it doesn't seem to be about journalism or corruption at all. Some of it, we're targeting scientists who are researching health effects of soda. So the speculation is that actually this was, yeah, they were looking at this soda tax, right? The speculation is that this was commercially motivated. The soft drink companies in Mexico didn't want a tax on their product.
I thought NSO Group was owned, I thought it's an Israeli, I thought it was an American company, but it's an Israeli group.
No, it's out of Israel. They are very sophisticated, so they have multiple iPhone exploits, which when Citizen Lab discovered it, they forwarded to Apple, and Apple fixed them. Those are known as 0 days. Does anyone know why they're called that? So when you discover a vulnerability, that's day 0. And then you count the days until it's fixed, right? Because that's a window where computers are vulnerable to an attack. Now, of course, if someone else found it first, maybe that window is a lot longer. But anyway, 0 day has become a term meaning an undisclosed exploit. Because if it was disclosed, then Apple and Google would fix it. So the original version of Pegasus they found had 3 0-day exploits for iPhones. And iPhones are actually quite secure. They're one of the most secure computing platforms. Apple's done a really nice job of this. So 3 iPhone 0-day exploits that can download spyware by clicking on a link, that's actually very expensive. It's expensive not just in the sense of difficult to find those vulnerabilities, but expensive in the sense that if you have one, you can sell that on the black market for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And to some extent that's good news because it means it limits this type of attack because it is expensive to do. The black market for these exploits also means that you don't have to have a incredibly good hacking staff to execute these attacks against journalists. You just have to have enough money. Right? I don't know what NSO Group charges, but I bet it's less than 100K to try to get a license to the technology. But again, if you know what phishing is, you can avoid this. I'm not going to go through all the stories. There are a lot of bad stories around this type of stuff. And the purpose of researching this stuff and publishing this stuff is to try to pressure NSO Group or the Israeli government to stop selling to regimes that abuse human rights. Right? This sort of pressure has worked successfully with American and European companies in the past. So far, after a couple of years of effort, it doesn't seem to have deterred NSO, but we keep trying. Here's another example of spear phishing. This seems to be calming down a little bit, but for a while the the Assad regime was very active in the cyber area. So again, what you do is you craft a message that will appear to your enemies, or will appeal to your enemies. So this was a message designed to appeal to anti-regime activists. And it was a pretty standard spear phishing. You clicked a link. It was a fake Facebook login page. They got your Facebook login credentials. After that, they do social network analysis, right? You can look at friends and trace all of this. This appears all over the world. Here's a Chinese example sent to Hong Kong news organizations. One of my Chinese colleagues very helpfully translated this. But it was a message about the umbrella movement. You all know what that is. Hong Kong democracy movement, circa 2014. So sent to news organizations and universities. Friends of mine have been targeted this way. But basically the solution is always the same, which is look at the URL. Most browsers have by default on, or you can turn on a preview of what URL it's going to go to. So one of the things you can do is just get into the habit of hovering over the link for a second and reading the URL. It's easy to turn on if it's not turned on by default. And also to get familiar with what should be a suspicious email, right? So this is one type of suspicious email. It's very generic. Here's another type of suspicious email. Any email which is trying to get you to do a password reset is suspicious. It could be real, but could also be fake. And here's another type of suspicious email. An email which purports to support your cause, whatever that may be, right? I have vital information about this thing that you care about, but I'm not going to tell you what the information is in the email. These are all things that should be suspicious to you. And so then you can take a moment and read the URL before you click. Especially read the URL before you type in a password. You should get into the habit of, before you hit enter on the password, read the URL. Okay, that's phishing. Any thoughts or questions? All right. Next up is the physical security of devices, right? So we've talked a lot about logins and communications. And by the way, phishing can come through every medium, not just email, right? It can come through Facebook. For a while, there was a phishing scam on Twitter that spread. And then it just said, spread through direct messages. And you just got a direct message from a friend that says, have you seen this photograph of you? And a link. And the link went through a fake Twitter login page. And if you gave your password, then they used that password to then send it to other people. So it actually spread all through the Twitter network. But you can also have situations where the physical device falls into your adversary's hands, right? So a laptop in this case, you know, this is heartbreaking. Everybody that he had talked to had to run because of this footage that was on this laptop, which might have been possible to avoid if the laptop was encrypted. So think about storage, right? Laptops, phones, USB sticks, memory cards, external hard drives, anywhere you've got a copy of something. Fortunately, we now live in an age where all devices have operating system level encryption. You need to turn that on. It's on by default in Android now. It didn't used to be, but it is now. You can turn it on when you do a Mac install. You can turn it on when you do a Windows install. You really should be running with that on. Again, it's one of these things where there's just no excuse not to do it. There's no inconvenience to you. Okay, so from basic security practice, we're going to take a little arc away from that and talk about the state of surveillance. We have reached a point in history where there is mass monitoring of the citizens of most countries by both state and private interests. That has some very shocking implications. I think it's going to be a long time before we figure out what that really means for civilization. But before we talk about unauthorized, large-scale collection of information, everybody should take an hour to use an incognito browser and see what they can find out about themselves through public information. And what you may find is that your privacy settings are not what you thought they were on Facebook, or maybe you had different expectations about what those privacy settings would do. So this is something I recommend every journalist do, is just look yourself up, background yourself. Imagine that you are researching someone else and apply it to yourself and see what you can find out publicly. Because if you expose things publicly, then nothing else really matters. We have long had a record of every phone call made. This indeed was the initial revelation from the Snowden documents, was that all of the domestic phone records were being sent to the NSA in this country. This does mean that there is a record anytime you call a source or send a text message. And those records are potentially subpoenaable. In this country, we have a certain amount of legal process about obtaining those records. In other countries, not so much. The government can just ask for them. There are several cases where this has gotten a journalist or a source into trouble. So basically, what they found is that this source, who was the source for a story about a classified operation in Yemen, had called the AP reporter. So they actually looked at this, at the source's phone calls. They also subpoenaed all of the phone records of the AP, right? Which caused a big stink at the time and led to a bunch of Department of Justice rules. There was this long document that the Obama Department of Justice issued that said that you shouldn't subpoena journalists' phone records except in extreme cases and only with the approval of the Attorney General. Who knows what the current Justice Department's position on this is. So this is the weakness of a norm versus a law, right? One of the questions, is there a gentleman's agreement protecting journalists' phone records, or is there actually a law which states what they have to do to get the records? There have been several failed attempts to pass so-called shield laws in this country. There are states and countries where shield laws exist. The laws basically say something like, a journalist can't be compelled by a law to reveal their source. And we've had cases where journalists, refuse to give up their sources and eventually have to be compelled by law to do it. But this game is changing, right? If you want to get privately leaked material or to keep an anonymous source, this is much harder than it used to be because there are records. There are records held by the phone company, there are records held by whatever platform you use to have the conversation. So just looking only at the phone company, I wanted to show you a piece that was done in 2012, which unfortunately, in the way of things, seems to have undergone some bit rot. So this map now says for development purposes only. But what this is this was a politician who requested from the phone company all of the records on where they've been. And how the phone company knows where you've been is because your phone has to connect to at least one cell tower. And it can only connect from at most a few kilometers away. And also each tower only covers a particular direction. So what you're looking at here is which towers the phone was in range of and the reception direction of those towers. So you can see him traveling around campaigning. And then it's hooked into their, this is all correlated with their Twitter account. So if you have their phone records and you have their Twitter messages, let's see here. The Twitter stuff appears here. You can get a pretty good sense of what that person was doing at any given moment. So all of us are carrying tracking devices, and even if there's no spyware on the phone, even if You're not using any apps that transmit your location, which, by the way, if you're using Google Maps, obviously it transmits your location, right? Even if you turn on all the privacy settings for Google, if you look up, if you open the app, it has to load the data near where you are, right? So Google knows where you are every time you open the app. But even if you're not doing anything like that, just from the fact of the phone connecting to the network, your location is being revealed. In fact, you get a distance from the tower too, because the transmission protocols, the 4G protocols, have to compensate for the round-trip light time from the phone to the tower. So they actually shift the phase of the signal to synchronize with the tower. So you actually get, if you can actually triangulate the location if you have multiple towers because you have a distance from each one. This is used by emergency services, by the way. It's actually a feature of the network to be able to identify someone's location within a few tens of meters. And you use this for finding people in earthquake rubble and that sort of thing. So it's actually required by law for the phone company to be able to figure out where you are. So add to phone company usage all of the apps that you use, which might send location data, all of the websites you go to, which track your IP address. There is data around which tracks you pretty closely. And then there's all the data you voluntarily give up, right? Every time you press a submit button on the internet. This was from a wonderful report from the Federal Trade Commission. It's a little old right now, but this diagram is still the best that I've found, talking about the information ecosystem, and this is just the inset. And what they've done here is they've listed concentric rings. Unfortunately, I've cut off the legend here, but the colors are different types of information. So, oh yeah, here you go. So medical information is pink here. And you can see how that will spread to healthcare analytics companies and various sorts of affiliates. Who does the billing for your hospital? They have a copy of that data. If you read very carefully the privacy policies, it will say that they can share it with people who process the data. And that is health data, which is some of the most regulated data in the US. It's really the only data around which we have strong privacy law. The privacy law is called HIPAA. There's all kinds of rules about sharing health information. But for, what you buy or what you post on social media, there's much less regulation, and it's really this big gray area. And then, of course, the social media platforms may be revealing information about you through your API. So for a few years, if you logged in anywhere with Facebook, that site got not just your personal information, but your friends list, which is huge, right? Contact information is some of the most revealing information, and also the likes of your friends. And the likes of your friends, that was the information that Cambridge Analytica used to build their micro-targeting models. Now, I should be clear, the question of whether or not political micro-targeting actually works is a different question. That is a much more complicated subject. My general sense of that is that the answer is kinda, sorta, but not really. I'm gonna actually put a link in the Slack. This is an excellent summary of, an excellent sort of skeptical account of the idea of using big data to influence populations. Clearly it works to some extent, but you can't just control people's minds because you know what they liked on Facebook. So let me post that in the class Slack. But anyway, we have to assume that more and more of this data is going to be available. And then there's just straight up government mass surveillance. So there are various vendors that build hardware devices whose only purpose is to monitor a network. What I love about this particular, so Unispeed is just one of them. What I love about this particular piece of advertising copy is where regulatory data retention and lawful interception does not survive for accuracy. So I think what they're saying is when you have to break the law to get the information you want. I'm not quite sure how they're spinning that, but when I read that, if lawful interception isn't enough, does that leave unlawful interception? Anyway, the hubris of these companies is stunning to me. Be that as it may, we long suspected and since 2013 have become aware that there is massive government surveillance of internet use. So now this is old. This is from I think it might have been like 2009 or 2010. This internal NSA slide deck. This was among the documents revealed by Snowden. And he revealed this network called X-Keyscore. I have no idea if X-Keyscore still exists or still goes by that name, but certainly something like this exists. And what this is this is a network of IP traffic recording stations that the US and allies, the so-called Five Eyes, so that's US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, right? There's a major intelligence cooperation agreement, has been since World War II, Commonwealth countries basically, to help each other monitor electronic communications. And now what that means is installing these network recording boxes or network monitoring boxes at ISPs the world over. So, domestically you put this at the AT&T's San Francisco office. In fact, there was a court case about that before Snowden where an AT&T employee knew of the government coming in and installing these boxes and filed suit on the grounds that this was warrantless surveillance. So we'll get to the Fourth Amendment issues of this in a minute. This can also be recording all of the cell traffic from the roof of the embassy. It can be putting a monitoring device where an undersea cable lands, where it first comes ashore. Anywhere you can get access to a big fat network pipe, you can put a monitoring device. And it's actually quite clever. So at the time, they stored 3 days full take for this network. Because the UK has weaker intelligence surveillance laws, basically American intelligence is not allowed to monitor American citizens, but UK intelligence is. So they had, at the time of the Snowden documents, a 30-day rolling buffer. So imagine that, right? You just store a buffer of 30 days of all internet traffic, or at least all internet traffic that could be communications, right? All of your messages. And yeah, it's encrypted, but you have all the metadata. And also, not all of it's encrypted, especially at that time. So you have a full take system, and then you have this, what they call a selector system, where it also stores for longer anytime you match a IP address, login name, instant messaging handle, email address, or match a keyword, right? So strong selection by selector, soft selection by content. So it's this very sophisticated system, and it's federated. So rather than trying to send all of this information back to the NSA headquarters in Maryland, what you do is you store it all locally, so you don't have to send, because otherwise you'd have to mirror all of this traffic in real time, right? You store it locally, and then you can do a federated search. So you send out one search query to all of these stations around the world. And it all comes back. So that's the state of the Five Eyes system. So here you can see the Five Eyes countries. I am sure that China has an equivalent system, definitely domestically, but I would be shocked if they didn't have an international monitoring system of a similar type. And of course, many other regimes, so we imagine that most of the Middle Eastern countries are running similar things domestically. So that is the environment in which the journalist is operating in, where every communication with every source or colleague is recorded somewhere. So then it becomes a question of who can get it and under what conditions. Oh yeah, here's more XKeyscore stuff, right? So basically what it records, it organizes things by session, which is basically just a sequence of like one TCP connection. Indexes it by this metadata, right? So even if it doesn't have the content of an instant message, so even if you're using WhatsApp, for example, Facebook doesn't know what's in the messages because they're end-to-end encrypted, but Facebook knows who you talked to. And the Five Eyes countries may not know who you talked to because they only see that you connected to the Facebook server, but they know that you are sending a message at that time, right? So you can kind of reconstruct this stuff. And then if you have all of the traffic going in and out of Facebook because you're monitoring the network, you can do correlations where you can say, whenever this person sends a message, this person receives a message, so I know these two people are talking and I know these are the messages they sent. You can do all of this crazy traffic analysis stuff. You can, if you have people's locations, you can look at who travels together. So that is another NSA program which is or was called Co-Traveler. There's a whole bunch of articles on doing machine learning to try to figure out, and they wanted to do terrorist detection, right? So so this is the like AI is directing drone strikes sort of sensationalism. This is a much more, again, skeptical article about it, which talks about, yeah, it's nice. We have slides on the classifier accuracy. This article talks about, you know, how they are actually using this data and what the accuracy of the system actually looks like and so forth. This is a really excellent article on ML for terrorism detection that you can take a look at. The short version is that while it is certainly worrisome, the idea of using classifiers to direct drone strikes, it seems unlikely that there's any sort of automated link between the classifiers and the strikes, right? It's not clear how they're using the output of those classifiers, and there's people, intelligence analysts in the middle of that. So it's not quite so clear. But it is worrisome because one of the first things that came out of this system that is doing machine learning was they identified a journalist who is reporting on terrorism. There you go. Bureau chief for Al Jazeera in Islamabad. So, I mean, I guess the algorithm worked, right? You did find someone who talks to terrorists. I mean, that's their job, but it worked. So anyway, there is a whole thicket of issues here which are very complicated, and we're not going to get super into them, except again to say that, you know, you are being watched. And then there's network censorship. So we've talked about surveillance. Now censorship is you just can't reach things. There are various ongoing research projects, such as the Open Network Initiative, that monitor what's reachable from where. Obviously, China is the pioneer in this system. The so-called Great Firewall prevents a lot of sites. And it's a political tool, right? They don't want citizens seeing certain types of media from the rest of the world. And it's also used to punish news organizations. At various points, the New York Times has been banned. I think it's still currently banned. What am I thinking of?
The Chinese version is not, but the English version.
The English one, okay. And then for a while, Reuters was blocked after they did, was it Reuters or Bloomberg? I think it was Bloomberg. Bloomberg did a big series on Chinese, the wealth of Chinese politicians. They were blocked for a while. Of course, to really understand this, the part of the context you need to understand is that the censorship is not just external, it's also internal. So there's very strong rules about what people are allowed to post on Chinese social networking sites. There's also automated filters. There's a changing list of keywords that you can't use on WeChat. So interestingly, actually, the keyword filters only apply when you have more than 2 people in the chat. So what they're interested in is suppressing group chat about certain types of conversations. Your message simply won't appear if it contains certain words. There's no list of those words. They change frequently depending on the political situation. It's all terribly murky.
It's also like always the interesting thing of like how people just treat the algorithm. So sometimes like when there's a sensitive topic, like people generate a photo and then post a photo on the reverse side, or just all type of things to try to post things without like being blocked by photos.
Or metaphors, right? Like people use.
Or like because the art just break down like all of the words into, because the Chinese letter, like you can basically break down each letter into like 2 parts, and then like in that way like, people can still read, but the algorithm just can't.
Yeah, so you get a lot of wordplay to try to get around the filters. Yeah, it is a really complicated and interesting topic. The Chinese information control regime is the most sophisticated that humanity has ever produced. As a scholar, I'm awed, like I'm so impressed. As a journalist, I'm really disturbed because, it goes against my American values of freedom of speech, right? I think you should be able to say these things. Of course, every country is now grappling with what you should be allowed to stay online, right? And I mean, that's something that's very important to understand about the Chinese regime. As problematic as it is, it also serves legitimate functions. A lot of what they would suppress, we would recognize as commercial scams, disinformation, false news, this type of stuff, right? So it turns out that every country is having to deal with the question of what types of information should be allowed to spread through the network. We do see a variety of approaches. Which is not to say that suppressing political speech is a legitimate thing to do in an open society, but anyway, moving on from that. Briefly, we should talk about SSL. SSL is, gives you the little lock icon in the browser. It is a fascinating protocol. It has a key vulnerability, which is that the only way that you know that you are connecting to the site that you think you know is because it has a certificate that is signed by a third-party certificate authority. There are hundreds of third-party certificate authorities. They actually pay the browser companies to put their certificate in the browser, right? So that's how all of this works, is that VeriSign pays Google so that Chrome has the VeriSign public key built into the browser, so that when you go to a site whose SSL certificate is signed by VeriSign, the browser is able to recognize that signature. Which works great until a government takes over a certificate authority. And so the key thing to understand about SSL from a security perspective is that the problem that it solves is not really encryption. Yes, there is encryption, and encryption is important, but encryption is the easy part. The hard part is identity, okay? You can always send encrypted messages to someone else. You make a connection to someone, you do public key exchange, you can send encrypted data. I mean, public key cryptography is kind of magic, but it doesn't actually solve the problem you want it to solve. And the reason is this. So think about how the internet operates, right? Person A wants to send something to person B, and we sort of imagine that we get this connection like this, because that's what a TCP connection is. It gives us the illusion of having a private connection. But of course, the connection is not private. It goes through any number of intermediate network nodes. Right? This is how the internet works. That's why it's called the internet. Right? It is a network of networks. Internet. Right? So it goes through all of these places. And so now you connect to B and you exchange a public key, do public key exchange with B. You don't know if you've actually exchanged the key with B or you've exchanged the key with M, the middleman, who maybe you did a public key exchange with M and they did their own public key exchange with B, and so now they are reading all of your decrypted traffic and forwarding it on invisibly, okay? That is the problem that SSL solves. The problem that SSL solves is when you say, hey, let's make a public key, is to know that you are talking directly to B. And the way you do that is you verify B's certificate, and B says, I am foo.com, and this certificate says foo.com, and you're like, yep, you have the foo.com certificate, and I trust VeriSign, right? This is the certificate authority here. The certificate authority puts their stamp of approval on this certificate, and you are trusting that the certificate authority is only going to issue one certificate to foo.com. And that once foo.com has that certificate, no one else can get a certificate. If M tries to get a certificate and says, I'm foo.com, the certificate authority says, no, you're not. I'm not going to give you a certificate. That's how HTTPS works. So this all works great until you have a compromised certificate authority that can issue fake certificates for the man in the middle. The reason I'm showing you all of this is because it actually happens. So in particular, this happened in, when was this? 2012, I think. Iran was man-in-the-middling all connections to Facebook. So how they actually pulled this off, there's a variety of ways you can do this. You can do it with a phishing attack where you log into redirects you to a fake Facebook page and then you go through that. Or you can just look for, if you control the network, you control the connections out of that country, you look for people trying to connect to Facebook, you connect to your own server instead. And if you can convince the browser that you have a valid certificate for facebook.com, then you'll get the little lock. It'll look like you have a secure connection, but you're actually being man-in-the-middled. The man-in-the-middle attack will come up again. It explains a number of features of how secure communications programs work. Yeah?
Is there any regulation on the CAs that exists, and can we enforce something that could prevent that? Like, I understand that taking over those by someone who wants to control it completely is causing this. So how can we ensure regulation on the third party?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really, the problem is you have to control it internationally, and you're looking for two different things, right? There's two different ways a CA can be compromised. One is just the state owns it, right? So I don't think there's an Iranian CA, but You know, there's probably a CA in the Middle East somewhere that is friendly to Iran and will issue a certificate. I mean, you have to assume that, in fact, we know for a fact that all of the major intelligence agencies have a supply of, can generate certificates for fake sites, right? So now to man in the middle, you still have to physically be on the network path, right? That's the complicated part. You have to not just have the fake cert, you have to have your traffic going through them, and there's various ways to accomplish that. So it's not super easy. So one is you can just have a friendly CA. The other is you could get the CA hacked, and this has happened too. You break into the company that issues the certificates and you steal their keys, and now you can issue your own certificate. So both of these things have happened. And it's a hard problem to secure the global network. And this is the lesson of cryptography over and over. The hard part is not the encryption, the hard part is key management. That's the tricky bit. Okay, so from there we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about the law. So all of this data is being collected, right? There's not a lot we can do about that. We'll talk a little bit about some mitigation strategies, but basically everything you're doing is being recorded somewhere by someone. So then the question is, who gets it? Who can access that information? And this is where law becomes very interesting. I'm going to talk only about the American situation. America has relatively strong laws around this type of access. Well, strong in some ways. For personal data collected by companies, the EU is stronger, of course. But we're just going to talk about the American landscape. So there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is there is law in the US, case law, specifically protecting journalists' work product. So that's a legal term, which means all of your notes, all of your files, all of your raw footage, interview transcripts, all of it, okay? The bad news is that's only if you're storing it. In other words, it prevents the police from coming into your newsroom and seizing your laptop or asking to copy your files. It doesn't prevent them from going to Amazon and asking to copy your files. There's old case law here called the third-party doctrine, and basically what that says is if someone else is storing the data, if you voluntarily gave data to someone else, you do not have an expectation of privacy under the Fourth Amendment. So this is a problem. It is a major legal loophole for the modern era. What companies will do if they want to put sensitive stuff in the cloud is they will sign a service agreement with Amazon or Google or whoever. And basically that's a contract that says, you know, Google can't tell law enforcement to go away. They have to comply with the law. But they can promise two things. They can promise that you will know if someone comes asking for your data, and they can promise that they will put their lawyer in front of it first, right? So they say, okay, we'll tell you if we have a law enforcement request for your data, and our lawyer will review the request to make sure that it complies with the legal standards before we do anything. So that gives you a chance to put your lawyer in front of the process. This is the actual third-party doctrine. This is the money quote from this 1979 Supreme Court case. And so what this case was about was whether someone who dialed a number into a payphone should be entitled, whether the law enforcement needs a warrant to get the number they dialed from the phone company. That's what this case was about. It was a case involving criminal investigation. And in 1979, the court said, no, you don't need a warrant to get the data from the number from the phone company because if you give information to a third party, you can't expect it to be private anymore. So in 1979, this kind of made sense. This makes less sense now. And in fact, the world is changing. Just this year, there was a court case at the Supreme Court again called Carpenter versus the United States, which set finally, this had happened at various lower courts, but finally set at the Supreme Court level the precedent that you can't just ask the phone company to turn over somebody's location. Now in this case, the police were monitoring, the police were asking for a week's worth of location data. So what had happened is they had gone and gotten this person's location for the last 7 days to see if they could place them at the scene of various robberies. And this was entered as evidence in the criminal conviction of this person. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the appeal said the government can't get his location without a warrant. They didn't get a warrant. They can't use this information in the trial. And the Supreme Court agreed. Now, the ruling was pretty narrow. We don't know if the Supreme Court will allow you to get location data with a warrant for less than 7 days, right? So if you only ask for 1 day or something. But I think that this is definitely going to make police departments pause, and it seems very likely that they will want to get a warrant before they get phone location data, just out of prudence, right? They don't want the case to fail because they got the information without a warrant. In general, in the last 10 years, we're slowly getting a series of rulings protecting our digital privacy. So for example, if you are arrested, you can't just grab all the data they can't just grab all the data on your phone. They need a warrant to do that. Now, of course, if they arrested you, they probably have probable cause to search your phone, but you can't just arbitrarily get people's phone. I don't think the Email Privacy Act ever passed, but this is another legal loophole. The law governing whether you need a warrant to read someone's email is from 1986. And basically it says that, you know, if you've stored data longer than 180 days, it's abandoned. Right? 1986, things were a little different. And so you can get abandoned data without a warrant. Anyway, this is how things are evolving. It's evolving rapidly. That is the sort of a brief overview of whether the American government can get the data that you and your source generate. There's also the question of private actors. And this is probably much more troublesome in most cases. We're starting to see actually what law enforcement requests to phone companies look like. In 2011, it was 1.3 million, so we can only assume it's more. Oh, and the major platforms now do transparency reports. So how often do they respond to data requests? And after Snowden, they added this column, which says how many people they gave up data on. Before, they just had the number of user data requests, but nobody knew if the NSA could send one request that says, give me all your user information. Just give it to me, all your user information for 2018, just go. But assuming that these companies are telling the truth, we now know that there does not appear to be in this country mass ingestion of user data from the social networking platforms. Now, that may not be true in China. I would be very surprised if there wasn't a lot more information sharing in other countries, but that seems to be the case in this country. And here's the Facebook version, right? Same thing. And I mean, you know, we're looking at all of this from the point of view of journalists and sources and trying to protect our work. And so we imagine that we're the good guys in this, and we, you know, want to assert our rights to privacy and to our sources' privacy, which is all true. But I mean, it's important to remember that most of these requests are criminal investigations, right? They're, you know, do you want to make it impossible to look into someone's Facebook account if there's a missing child, right? Most of this stuff is what you might call routine law enforcement requests. And so how this works is they actually have a lawyer look at every single request and decide whether they're going to give up the data. And you can see here that they say yes about 80% of the time. Okay. So who has a thought about all of that?
It says some data produced. I'd be curious to know exactly what is being produced.
Yeah, right. So they might give some information, but not all of it. Yeah, good question.
Also, I'd like to know like when they actually say no, like what actually happens.
Generally, they'll say no if the request is not legal. That's the only way they can say no.
Okay. Yeah.
Even so, there were attempts by the NSA to go in the back door. So one of the things that came out with the Snowden leaks is that there was NSA monitoring of so Google leased a data connection between one of their UK and US data centers. So right, this is just their private, it's not the internet, right? It's a private network to move data around for backups and replication and so forth. And that connection was not encrypted because it was a private connection. And that was being monitored. It is always possible, and indeed there is a history of intelligence agencies trying to go in through the back door as opposed to going through the front door of legal requests. Apparently there was swearing at Google when those stories came out, and at this point Google, and I would imagine most major cloud service providers now encrypt the data that gets sent over their leased lines, their private networks. Okay. So I've talked about all of the basics of digital security for journalism. I've talked about the state of mass surveillance, what actually is being collected, which is more or less everything is being collected by someone. And I've talked about some of the American law about who gets access to this data. All right, so this is all sort of setting the stage. This is background. What I want to teach you now, because you are advanced students, is I want to teach you how to do security planning, digital security planning for a particular story and context. And the method that I'm going to teach you is a classic computer security method. It's called threat modeling. And here's the idea. You want to try to imagine what are the bad things that are going to happen and how do we protect against them. So usually what you're trying to do is keep secrets in some way. Now backing up slightly, the higher level goals are to protect sources, protect colleagues, protect your operations, protect the reputation of yourself and your news organization. Normally that involves keeping things secret. So you have to figure out what you want to keep secret, and then also who are you keeping it secret from? You know, we've talked a lot about keeping it secret from state actors, but the state is not always the threat. Often the subject of your story is the threat. Or, for example, it could be drug cartels. That's a very real threat with very real consequences. And then you have to ask, how can they get this information you want to keep secret? And I think people with computer science training tend to imagine it's all about hacking. And indeed, there's some hacking that goes on, but it could be easier to file a lawsuit. Or it could be easier to just get someone in your news organization drunk. Or it could be easier to steal a laptop. Okay, so you gotta think from their point of view, not from the like elite hacker type of threat. And then it's important to consider the consequences as well. And the reason I say that is you have to understand the risks that you are taking, and the sources have to understand the risks that they are taking. Journalism ethics demands informed consent for risks that the sources you are talking to are taking, right? You are asking somebody to put something on the line for you. Obviously, you try your best to protect them. You can't necessarily guarantee that. So first of all, there's the question of what's private. Obviously, you're probably going to think of your emails and text messages, but you may not think of your address book. Now, we've studied social network analysis prior. We know that just the network topology, without any of the data of who's saying what to whom or what they're doing, is extremely valuable information. So let me ask you this. How many copies of your address book are there, and where are they, and who has them? So let's try it. So where is your address book? Phone, all right, so that's the obvious one. Okay, where else?
Google.
Yep, Google has all of your contacts. They have their own like address application. Everyone your email, some of the people you call to, people you have messages with, people you have video conferences with. What else?
My laptop's have it downloaded as well.
Yep, it's probably synced to your phone.
Facebook Messenger probably.
Yep. Huh? iCloud, yep. So that's Apple. Apple has a copy of it, maybe. What's that? Gmail. Yeah, we've got Google already. Yeah, okay, so rather than listing all of these, we're just going to say Snapchat, Instagram, etc. WhatsApp, WeChat. Yeah.
I tried to do Truecaller on something today, and it asked me to allow it to see all my contacts, and I did allow it. So.
Right, so apps. Oh my God, every app that you've ever said, access my contacts, right? So, you know, some of those are a little startup. They're not really thinking about privacy, right? So this is the issue with granting people permission to see your address book is you don't know how well they're going to protect it, right? If I want your address book, I don't have to hack you. I just have to hack one of the shitty little apps that you've installed, right? And so you have to think about the security of every single one of these places. The other big one that no one's mentioned yet is backups. Do you have a backup of your drive somewhere? Do you have a backup of your phone? Where is it? Is it encrypted? All right. Did we miss anything? I bet there's a big one we're not thinking of. Probably good for now. So you can do this exercise for any of your data, and you should, right? Where is this sensitive stuff stored? You probably have 10 copies of it. You know, how classified documents were handled in the paper era is you had every copy of a classified document had a number, you know, copy 3 of 7, and there was a logbook in the central files that listed who had every single copy, and if you wanted to take that copy to your office and read it, you had to sign it out. So if you want to track sensitive data, you have to do the same thing. You have to keep track of where that data is. And that has become much harder because we have all these cloud services. This is also the moment where we introduce the difference between privacy versus anonymity. So what's the difference between an encrypted message and an anonymous message?
An encrypted message, you can't see the content, but you can still see who it's from.
Okay, right, exactly. So anonymity is privacy of identity. So we'll get to that. That's quite hard to do. The next question you have to ask after the what data question is the who wants to know question. In security language, we call this the adversary, right? And I think people are now sort of getting used to the idea that it's not always the government who's the problem. For a long time, this was the only thing that security people thought about. And you know, indeed, we've seen cases where it is a problem, right? So this was an AP source busted by law enforcement getting phone records, right? So it happens. But in many cases, it is not law enforcement that is the issue. So who else could it be if it's not law enforcement? What are some examples of threats, adversaries? Your enemies, okay. So who are journalism enemies? I said that journalists are targets. Who are journalists targeted by? Sorry, what?
Terrorist group?
Terrorist groups, yeah, depending where you're operating, yeah.
Your sources, like if they don't actually like what you're doing.
If they don't like you. Potentially. I mean, most of the time these guys play relatively clean, but not always.
Special interest groups?
Yeah, there could be particular groups that don't like what you're doing, right? So the subject of your story or interest groups around this story, if you're saying a lot of mean things about banks, right? We're now seeing sort of organized political harassment, doxing and so forth, right? Remember, they don't have to ruin your story, they just have to make your life hard. Although they might ruin the story. Could be a lot of people. And then the question you have to ask is, okay, so what can they do to find this stuff out, or harass you, or slow you down, or you know, threaten you? And these are sort of the categories that I've divided it into. We've talked about technical problems in a bunch of ways. We've talked about legal problems. We haven't talked about social very much. Notice I put phishing under social. That's because phishing is not a technical exploit, okay? It's a social exploit. It relies on tricking somebody. Any time you're relying on fooling someone or exploiting trust, there is likely not a technical solution to the problem. Right? That is a human problem, not a technical problem. We've talked about physical briefly. You know, if someone can get into your server room and connect a keyboard to your server, I mean, game over, right? You can do anything you want at that point. So you got to lock that door. You know, when the New York Times was reporting on the Snowden material, they kept it on an air-gapped machine in a locked door in the New York Times building with guards outside. That's the only way to do it, right? And that is the most sensitive material that journalists have ever worked with. Not only this government, but most governments wanted a copy of that, right? Like if you're an enemy of the United States, or even if you're just a foreign intelligence agency, you want those documents. So, and believe me, most of them were never released, right? The journalists working on that stuff made a lot of redactions and a lot of very careful judgment calls about what was released publicly. Of course, people debate hotly whether they made the right calls. Some people think they released too much, some people released too little. But the point is they had to keep it secret. And so they didn't use any cloud storage. And they had it physically secure, and they had it on premises. And doing it on premises gives them additional legal protection because it's hard to have police busting down the door of a news organization. There's laws against that. We haven't talked about operational security much. Operational security has to do with the day-to-day process, the habits of security. So if you're communicating over a secure channel with an anonymous source, you can't ever use a non-anonymous channel with them. I want to show you an amazing document that was written by Dulles, after which Dulles Airports is named. Alan Dulles. He was the CIA director for a while. And it's called the 73 Rules of Spycraft. And it's this crazy very like cloak and dagger World War II era, because he started intelligence during World War II. All of these rules of spycraft, and it's like, tells you how to use the phone and the post, and a lot of it doesn't apply anymore, but a lot of it really does. But look at number 2. It consists in carrying out daily tasks with painstaking remembrance of the tiny things that security demands. Security is habits, okay? It's not installing the right software. It's not, having a security meeting. It's not hiring a security consultant just once. It's learning the habits that you need to stay secure, right? You gotta get your encryption right. You gotta use the right communication methods every single time. It's really annoying. Security isn't free. You have to remember to do things. You have to use awkward software. Anyway, security is about habit, and Alan Dulles is great. And I'm going to paste this in the Slack channel just because it's so much fun to read. Yeah, booze is naturally dangerous. Sex and business don't mix. There's really good stuff here. And then there's like really basic spycraft. If you have a rendezvous, first make sure you are not followed. I mean, I don't know. It's all very old-fashioned, but actually a lot of it is still very good advice. Turn the blackout to good use. Well, that's not happening when we're not in world wars. Anyway, so that's operational security. Operational security is about habits. It's about keeping your mouth shut. If you're working on a sensitive story, don't tell people, okay? Just, it should go without saying, but it doesn't somehow. Yes?
Can habits be bad as well?
Sure, you can have bad habits.
Can good habits be bad, meaning that you have patterns, and if someone learns of these patterns, then you expose yourself?
I mean, in theory, but I mean, what I will say is that having a security plan is much better than not having a security plan.
Right, but to make it even stronger, would you advise mixing up those habits? I know it's very theoretical.
Yeah, so I do know one reporter who, in order to hide who their source in a government department was, they made a habit of calling lots and lots of people about stupid things in that department. So now their phone records show they talk to 20 people and not 1 people, so think about if they're trying to investigate who the source was, the first thing they have to figure out is who's the list of suspects. You want to make that list of suspects big. Okay. Here's an example of a legal threat. So this was a New York Times reporter named James Risen who the Risen and the Times actually fought back for many years to try to prevent being compelled to disclose his source. I can't remember how this actually turned out, whether or not, he did go to court, I can't remember what happened. But, you gotta remember this stuff, right? If your adversary can file a lawsuit that can compel you to disclose, you have different types of problems than if they can't. So let's go through some scenarios briefly. These actually used to be an assignment. You would pick one and write out a security plan. So this is a sort of classic one, which is you have sensitive material in a war zone that you're trying to get out of the country. So thoughts? How do you do this? How do you get your pictures home?
Encrypt them.
So encryption, great start. So encrypt what?
The image data.
Right, so first of all, you should be storing them encrypted. Otherwise, you are this guy we saw at the beginning. Oh, I went right past it. Right, this is, a real, right, so don't be that guy. So, okay, so encrypt the material on your laptop.
I'd say keep it off the wire.
Well, you got to put it on the wire at some point because you got to get it home. Although,
so you're saying it's a better idea to encrypt it and trust the internet cafe and to hide it somewhere on you to try to get smuggle out of the country?
So that actually mostly depends on the time frame. So if you're working for a wire service and you're doing breaking news, you're probably not gonna have time to mail it home or fly it home. You really want to transmit it home. But yeah, walking across a border with the data can be better than sending it. But certainly if you're gonna send it, you should encrypt it on the wire, right? So you can sort of see these are the general ideas. In practice, there's another part of this which this setup doesn't really talk about, which is you really have to protect your address book. Your address book, your travel itinerary, your location. I mean, if the phone records show that you visited someone's house, that's really bad. So actually, if location is a problem, meeting sources out somewhere is a lot better than going to their houses or their work. You have to think about these sorts of things. All right, let's try another one. This is a corporate example. You're trying to get some inside material on insider trading. So how do they get this material to you? What would you advise them to do? You're talking to them and you're like, okay, okay, I've got documents that's going to blow this story open. I want to get them to you.
What did they do with Snowden? They sent it to another reporter, and then I don't think they told that reporter that it was coming. He was kind of sitting in their hallway for a week because they were on vacation.
Oh, interesting. I don't know that part of the story.
Yeah. I think it was a second copy. Luckily, no one ever discovered it, but the box was just sitting in the hallway for a week.
Crazy.
So I don't know, maybe getting a third party involved?
Yeah, so you could tell them to mail it to someone else?
Inform them?
Yeah, okay.
If the documents are not digital, then don't leave it. Like,
Don't.
don't convert them to digital. Let it just be off.
Yeah, so paper can be, it has some problems, but paper can be a very good secure medium because you can't view it remotely. There's no possibility of hacking. And everybody understands the security properties of paper. Everybody understands under what circumstances paper is secure and not secure. The disadvantage of paper is that you can't encrypt it. So physical security is harder with paper, whereas it's easier with an encrypted card. But sure, they could get it on paper. You definitely want to tell the source not to email it from their work account. I mean, I know this sounds stupid, but people do this. You might want to consider whether or not downloading the data is going to be logged. The safest thing for them to do, if they can manage it, is probably for them to bring the material home, whether in paper or digital form. And then...
Isn't that breaking the law though?
Potentially. It depends.
Would you also have to maybe create a different account so that no one can see that you are receiving it, or would that be not revealing your identity?
Well, so your account is okay, their account is the problem, right? Or connections between the two is the problem. So, for example, if they take the material home and email it to you from their home computer using their home account, again, think about the threats, right? The company is going to file a lawsuit. They're going to do an investigation. Certainly the company computer and the company network is monitored. They may be able to compel the employee to turn over their personal laptop. They may be able to file a lawsuit which compels them to turn over their personal laptop, right? So, it's a combination of legal, technical, and social threats, right? What's going to happen when this person is interrogated by corporate security? Is there recording on the company network? Can they file a lawsuit to compel this type of information? And so anyway, all of this boils out to, surprisingly, one of the best ways to get leaked material across is to meet someone in person and hand it over. That still works really well. If you can manage to do that and do that privately, that is a pretty secure thing to do. And that's been the case for 40 years, right? We're still meeting people in parking lots and handing over envelopes. if you're going to do it online, you should use Secure Drop. We'll cover that in a minute. Here's another one. Here's where you're reporting on the police. All right. Now, of course, this is journalism. Eventually, they're going to know your story, but you still want to preserve their sources, and you also don't want them to know before it's published. So let's go through the threat modeling list. So what are you trying to keep private?
Identity of the police officer and agents.
Right. So identity of the sources. Yep.
The type of materials they're giving.
Yeah. What they're giving you. What else?
Maybe then, could you like also try to eliminate any like timestamp or something if someone.
Yeah, the details of the information that they're giving you. And also the fact that there is a story is something that you want to keep secret. Okay, so who are you trying to keep it secret from?
Their employer.
Yeah, the police commissioner, probably other people in the department.
So the police officers accused of misconduct?
Yeah, probably them too. Yep. What can they do to find out these secret things? How could they find out who you're talking to, what they told you, or even that you are working on a story?
Do they have access to our communication metadata?
I don't know, do they?
Possibly.
What are you thinking?
Like phone call metadata?
So, right, so if you are the subject of a criminal investigation, then they can get a warrant to get the data. Depending where you are in the world, maybe they would, right? Not all countries would require a warrant for the police to get that information. So it depends. What else can they do to find this out?
Saw you talking to all the people.
Yeah, just observing. So, have the conversations in private. They can also interview your sources, right? If they suspect, they can start asking around inside the department. So that's something you have to consider. And then finally, the last threat modeling question. So what happens if they find out? What happens if they manage to figure out what you're doing and what you know?
Publish the story already?
Yeah, so maybe the story has to go before it's ready. Maybe there is no story. What else can happen?
Destroy whatever you have in case you don't.
Destroy what?
Destroy the material that you have if it's going to create like harm to someone.
Oh, you're saying you should destroy the material if they find out. You're saying they can?
If they could do something after obtaining it, like they know about it, but they don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So then you have the option of like deciding whether destroying the files itself would still put you in a better position.
Mm. Yeah, so that's the end of the story.
Warrant or subpoena or something.
Yeah, if they're trying to subpoena the material, you can't destroy it. Otherwise, you have additional penalties. What?
Simply get ahead of the narrative. Like if they find out about your story with enough lead time to preempt the claims that you make in the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they could sort of win the PR war. What happens to the people you're talking to? What about that?
You should tell them right away if you think you've been found out.
Sure, but what can happen to them? What is the risk to them?
Retaliation.
Yeah, they could lose their jobs, for example. Yeah. Or potentially end up in jail, depending on the circumstances and the context. And then there's this one. This one is a little too real, right? This is a very complicated security situation where there are intense both physical threats and digital threats, which brings up a really important point. I've been describing digital security for journalism. Security you can't really split off the digital from the rest of it, from the legal and the physical and the psychological security. All of this stuff has to be in one plan, right? So to protect against the digital threats in this environment, you also have to protect against the physical threats. So, and these connect in a bunch of ways. For example, the purpose of installing spyware through a phishing link may be to figure out where you are, because then they can track your location through your phone for a physical attack. Or there could be a physical raid on an office to seize your materials to figure out what's happening. So all of this stuff interconnects. And if you're doing digital security, you have to talk to the people who are doing the physical security and coordinate. And I mentioned also psychological security. A lot of the people working with material coming out of war zones, even if they're not in the country, eventually develop PTSD, right? There's only so many beheadings you can watch before you develop psychological problems. So that is a security issue as well. We have here at the school, on the 4th floor, the DART Center for Conflict and Trauma. So we actually have a bunch of specialists, experts in reporting in conflict zones, reporting under threat, dealing with trauma inflicted on journalists. It's a whole subject in itself that our technical security plan has to fit into. Okay. The last part of this class today is what I call the recipes. So recipes are some advice on solving specific problems. There is no one-size-fits-all security advice. I can only give you some hints on trying to do particular things, because this is normally what people want when they ask you, right? So a reporter will come to you, and rather than saying, let's make a security plan for this story, they'll say, what app should I use for anonymous communication? What's the answer, by the way, to what app should I use for anonymous communication? Apps don't give you anonymous communication. That's the answer. Now, having said that, I'm going to give you a recipe for doing this. But bear in mind, it's not the app that gives you the anonymity. It's the habits that give you the anonymity, okay? So let's talk about secure communication. The first thing you should be aware of is that any data which exists for a long time is subject to popping up and damaging you later. It may be leaked. It may appear in court. Anything that you type into the company Slack, you should imagine being read aloud in a court case. So this was a transcript of a internal campfire chat, which is like Slack, that Gawker had around the publication of the Hulk Hogan sex tape. Some of you may know that this was the court case which destroyed Gawker. They were ordered to pay $100 million fine for privacy violation. They went bankrupt. That's the end of them. Do you want that phrase read aloud in court? That's what you should be thinking whenever you're typing into Slack. Chats last forever. One way to mitigate this is to have a data retention policy. It's really important to have a standard policy so you can say, oh, we delete all chat logs older than a year. Because if you start deleting things when there's a subpoena, that can get you into legal trouble. So the way to solve this problem of chat logs and other types of data lasting forever is just to have a regular deletion policy. If you use iMessage, there is actually now a automatically delete all messages older than a year. I recommend you turn that on. You know, how often do you actually look at messages older than a year, right? Have you ever looked at messages older than a year? This will save you later, because by the time somebody is asking for that message, it's too late. You can't delete it later. Text messaging. So SMS, actual like standard text message, is unencrypted over the air. It's like the least secure thing you could imagine. It's broadcast unencrypted. There was a beautiful piece of art in Madison Square Park a few years ago, which just was a little box with an antenna and a printer, and it just printed out every text message that it received. It was kind of beautiful just reading them, but anyway, not secure. So you got to use some sort of IP messaging system, which also means, by the way, that iMessage will default to text if it can't send through the network. You really need to turn that off. So otherwise, one of the most secure ways becomes one of the least secure ways. Most messaging apps are not encrypted, and the messages can be read by the parent company, which means it can be subpoenaed. The exception is Signal and now WhatsApp. Also iMessage, to the best of my knowledge, the data that is in iCloud cannot be read by Apple. So as evidence of that, you will recall perhaps the case where the FBI wanted to get into an iPhone owned by the San Bernardino shooter, and they couldn't, and Apple wouldn't help them. So it's actually designed so that Apple can't break it. So to understand whether a messaging system is secure against subpoenas, I use what I call the Mud Puddle Test. The Mud Puddle Test is you're walking down the street and you drop your phone or your laptop into a muddy puddle of water, and you call up Apple or Google or Facebook or whatever, and you say, oh man, my phone's destroyed. Help me get my messages back. And if they say, yes, we will help you do that, it's not secure. Okay? Now, in the case of iCloud, the data is stored on Apple servers, but the key is on the local device. That's how they manage it. Apple changed this policy after a bunch of iCloud hacks. You may remember, I think it was 2014, a bunch of nude celebrity pictures going around the internet. That was done by logging into iCloud accounts. That is no longer possible. All of the iCloud storage is now encrypted. It is encrypted with a key that is on the device. There is a secure area of the device, and I think now in the laptops as well. And that key is mixed with your passcode key. So the password unlocks the access to the secure key, which unlocks the access to your iCloud storage. Which is why iMessage is reasonably secure. I'm not sure if Apple has the metadata or not, but they certainly don't have the text. Oh yeah, SMS. You can buy this device and read SMS. Or you can, I'm sure you could do it with a $30 software-defined radio as well. This is what I just said about iMessage. You want to turn this little send as SMS thing off. Otherwise, one of the most secure ways to talk to people becomes one of the least secure. WhatsApp, a couple years ago, implemented the Signal protocol. WhatsApp is the most secure, widely used messaging platform. So it's probably a win if you can get your sources to talk to you through WhatsApp. Now the metadata is still available to Facebook, which means it's still available to anybody who can hack into Facebook and anybody who can subpoena Facebook. So you have to consider whether your adversary can do either of those two things. But assuming that they can't, and you know, Facebook spends a lot of money on security, they're, as these things go, reasonably secure, which means that WhatsApp is a pretty good answer to secure communication. And it's available in most countries. Most people already have it installed. The situation has improved dramatically because of this choice on Facebook's part, which is also causing them all sorts of headaches because people are using it to spread rumors and misinformation, and they can't intervene because they don't know what the messages are. I mean, that's the balance. Signal is the gold standard, and in part because of its encryption and this thing called ratchet. Actually, this is no longer true. It's now just called the Signal protocol. It used to be called the axolotl ratchet. It's called a ratchet. Anyone know why? Anyone know how Signal security works? And this is actually relevant to threat modeling email as well. So let's talk about PGP, which I do not recommend, by the way. Here's an email. It is encrypted with some key, key A, and you create that key and you send 100 emails, and every one of those emails is encrypted with the same key. So this is how PGP works. The difficulty here is that if anyone ever gets this key, they can read everything you ever sent. What Signal does, and WhatsApp as well, is a little different. It uses a key mechanism called a ratchet. And a ratchet is a mechanical device that can only turn one direction, right? It can only turn forward. I'm going to get this wrong. Let me think about this for a second. What happens is that each message is encrypted with a different key, right? So that's the first thing, is that you actually encrypt it with a key that is derived from your personal key and some information from the last message. So each message actually stores a hash of the previous message. And this does two things. First, it means that you can't fake a message later, right? So if you have a sequences of messages, you can't like insert one in there and forge the message and say, they sent this message too, even if you get the person's key, right? So even if they steal your Signal private key, they can't fake evidence later, right? That's one thing that this hash does. This, by the way, is the chain in blockchain, by the way. Blockchain's exactly the same idea. You have a hash list pointing back. The other thing that it does is this hash is one of the inputs to the key for this message, which means that you actually have a different key for every message, which means that if someone, which is not the same as your private key, which means that if someone manages to get into your phone and dump the Signal's data storage and get your private key, they still can't read the messages you've already sent, right? Because they depend on a key that was generated just for that message. So this property of Signal is also called forward secrecy, which means that even if you get the private key later, you can't read the previous messages. This is not a property that PGP has, which is another problem with PGP. The other really nice thing about Signal is that they store very little information. And they've always said this. We know it's true because this is the documentation that Signal provided in response to a subpoena. So the only thing they know is the account name, the creation date, and the last connection date. That's it. They don't store any information about who talks to who. So that's how they solve this problem of subpoena has to cooperate with law enforcement just like everybody else. They solve the problem by just not storing anything. So Signal is ideal, and I've had people working in intelligence tell me that that's the only thing they trust. Yeah?
Are there laws in this country that require you to, keep logs? So I noticed a lot of the VPN providers that do this, that don't store logs, they're always offshore somewhere.
So there is a big legal fight. So there are laws that require phone companies to keep logs.
Okay.
And also provide the ability to wiretap, basically. I mean, wiretaps are not done with wires anymore. They're done by programming the switch to record the call. There are ongoing legal fights about whether you can have a system that doesn't store data and has no encryption. For the moment, it's legal. But Signal's also relatively a small player, right? So, for example, the Apple versus FBI case was about this principle. And Apple fought on the principle that says, no, it should be possible for our users to have actually secure communication that law enforcement cannot get into. And of course, law enforcement sees it differently. There is a long history of fights around access to cryptography. None of you are old enough to remember the crypto wars of the 90s. There was a proposal called the Clipper chip, which was, you know what, this internet thing needs cryptography. Everybody needs encrypted communication. Let's give everybody a standard chip which does secure communication, except that there's a backdoor. We'll make an institution which will do key escrow, which will keep the keys to all these chips. And if law enforcement needs to get into your phone or your email, then they can get a warrant and get the key and unlock the encryption. The problem, so aside from the issue of whether it should be legal to use encryption that law enforcement cannot break, which is a worldwide fight that's going on in law and policy. The problem with key escrow is that the stored keys become an immensely valuable target. And if you look at the history of hacks, it seems to be more or less impossible to secure a large volume of extremely valuable data. Imagine if that data was encryption key to everything else. So anyway, this is a fight that keeps happening. For the moment, it is possible to have to use unbreakable private communications. But again, that's just the phone, right? Anonymity does not come from encryption. Anonymity comes from very, very careful habits. Moving on to email. Don't use email for secure stuff if you can avoid it. That's the bad news. The good news is if Google is not a threat, then Gmail is pretty good. So Google puts an enormous amount of money into security. They have the best security track record of any of the major tech platforms. I don't think they've ever had a major security breach. They put a lot of money and effort into this. And if both ends of the conversation are using Gmail, then of course Gmail knows what you're talking about. But if your adversary can't get information from Gmail, then you're probably good. So if your adversary is the American government, then okay, they can subpoena Gmail. If your adversary is the Chinese government, then Google is probably not going to give them information, which is why Gmail is blocked in China. Also, corporate adversaries are unlikely to be able to subpoena Google. PGP is a disaster. Cryptographically, it's okay. It suffers from this forward secrecy, the lack of forward secrecy, so it's not great. The problem is the usability. It's very hard to use properly, and it also doesn't give you metadata. And also there was a big security hole found in it earlier this year. So I would say avoid it if you can. This is the issue with email, is that, again, there's all these intermediaries, right? So if someone's sending you an email from their work computer, so for example, it goes to the company network. And then nowadays, most of the connections, like if you're sending an email from Google to Yahoo, at some point there's got to be a connection between a Google server and a Yahoo server. It used to be that those connections weren't necessarily encrypted. Now they mostly are. But if it goes to a smaller ISP, it might not be. Basically, you have no guarantee that any part of that transit is going to be connected or secure. Email is the worst. Except it's the only truly federated communication medium we have. It's the only communication platform that isn't run by a single company. Anyway, that's the world we live in. This is how you should think of an email. You are sending a postcard. Everybody can read it. Phones. As we saw earlier, they just leave data like crazy. In most cases, only state actors can get at that data. In many cases, they need a warrant to do so. But as we've seen, sources have been busted by this stuff. So I don't know. I kind of think that VoIP is probably a better call. But Skype is going to respond to a subpoena. Google's going to respond to a subpoena. But you can do calls through Signal and WhatsApp. Okay, that's communications. We're now going to talk about storing data. As I mentioned earlier, the key question you have to ask is how many copies and where are they? If you don't know that, you cannot securely store data. You also have to think about erasing files. Just putting something in the trash does not remove it from the disk. You can still recover it with forensic programs. Emptying the trash does not remove it from the disk either. It just removes it from the file system. So if there is a secure erase feature built into macOS now, I think there's also one in Windows. If not, there's various utilities. If you really want to be sure, destroy the media. Just smash your USB drive with a hammer. Then you have to think about the physical security. You know, if you have an unencrypted memory card in your desk drawer, that's probably terrible. Also, physical access, right? If you leave your computer to go to lunch and the screensaver has a 5-minute delay, or you don't have the screen lock, then someone can sit down and install spyware while you're not sitting there. So you have to ask questions like, how easy is it for someone to just walk into your office and sit down at your computer? All it takes is guts, right? There's probably nobody who's going to stall them. Oh, you know, I'm Jonathan's friend. He asked me to get a file. That would probably work. All right, finally, I'm going to talk about anonymous sources. Anonymity and privacy are really different things. The problem is linkability. So we all have many online identities. The issue with anonymous communication is not so much that the person has no identity. Of course they have the identity. They have the identity of the person, you know, they're using a particular account to talk to you. The problem is making sure that you can't link that identity to, say, their email identity or their legal name. So the way to think about anonymity is the linkability of different accounts. This is how you should think about any communication you send where the metadata is available, right? So it's not a postcard, so now you can't get inside, but anybody can see the address. And by the way, everything that you send through the US Postal Service, they scan and save the address. That's how they trace mail bombs and so forth. So the post office knows who's sending what. This is the difficulty with sending up anonymous communication. This is a lovely comment by Barton Gellman, who was involved in a lot of the Snowden reporting. And, you know, it's a lot of work to set up anonymous communication, and you don't want to make sources feel like they're doing something wrong. That's the challenge here. In order to not have metadata linking you to the source, every contact with the source has to be through an anonymous channel. And that's very hard to do. That means every contact, including the first contact. And so you can have this conversation, but it's a tough sell. This is one of the major challenges in journalism security, is what I call the first contact problem. The only answer that I've ever found to the first contact problem is you just need to use a secure communication channel from the start. So this is easier than it used to be. You can now say, oh, I use WhatsApp for everything. The only problem with WhatsApp is that I think it exposes your phone number, so then they could just text you. But hopefully they just use WhatsApp for everything. And so there's the conversation you can have. Yeah, let me add you on WhatsApp. I use WhatsApp for all my communications with everybody just to protect everybody's security, just standard. One of the problems you have here is that you don't know which sources are going to become sensitive sources later. So the only thing you can do is treat every source as a sensitive source. Anonymous browsing. When you go to a website, they know your IP address. The Tor obfuscates the IP address by routing it through a bunch of computers. They use 3 computers so that The computer in the middle or at the beginning doesn't know who you're talking to, and the computer at the end who doesn't know who's talking to them. You've all heard of Tor, I think? Tor does work, but it's important to understand what it works for. In particular, it doesn't encrypt traffic. So if you're not using HTTPS, then someone here in the network can see what you're doing. And if you log in using your Gmail account over Tor, then this computer knows it's you, right? So the only thing Tor does is hide your IP address. It's a useful part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. The easiest way to use Tor is to just install the Tor browser. You can also make other network connections, like I've done scrapes through Tor, by setting it up as a proxy on your local machine. There is now, we were all sort of waiting for this to happen, there is now one case where the subject of a story figured out that a story was being written about them, one documented case, figured out that a story was being written about them by looking at the IP of the people connecting to the website. So here it is. I'm sure it's happened in other cases, but we know this because it came up in a basically unrelated court case. New York Times had been on the company's website 12 times that day or that week. I just have a feeling it might be this reporter snooping around trying to build a story. So this is the problem that Tor will solve for you. The last thing I want to talk about today is securely handling leaks. This is in the recipes category again. So we're going to assume we're in a context where you're trying to prevent your adversary from knowing who gave you the data. Obviously, you can't use a corporate network. If they do it from a personal laptop, there's going to be various types of identification. You know, if they do it from their email account, obviously it's from their email account. The best thing you can do is still meet them and hand something over. Beyond that, the safest thing you can do is the model that was pioneered by WikiLeaks. You've got to give credit where credit is due, which is just don't know the identity of the source. Now, there is a trust problem here. Obviously, that only works if you have an independent way to verify the material. Right? If it's material that you know is true because of who is giving it to you, then you have to know the identity of the person giving it to you. But if you don't have to know, that's the safest thing you can do, because then there's no way you can be forced to reveal their identity. Secure drop is now the gold standard for electronic submission to journalists. Who's heard of Secure drop? Yeah, okay, less than all of you. Secure drop is a piece of open source software that runs a secure Dropbox. So a physical Dropbox is a place where you leave material and someone comes and picks up later and you don't ever have to meet and know each other's identity. So what this is it's a place where you can upload files and it forces you to connect through Tor. So there's no way to connect to it that reveals your IP address. And then it also, basically you can log in and create a mailbox so you can leave messages for each other. So it's not just someone throws you something and you don't know who it is. You can talk to them by leaving a message, and when they log in later they can get the message. And maybe you can set up you know, some other method of communication through this. Most major news organizations now have a secure drop server. This is become the gold standard in electronically leaking material. Now, you still have to use some thought, because if you're the only person on your network using Tor, they can figure out it was you. In fact, this is a real case. I don't think I have the slide, but it was a case where a student didn't want to go to an exam, so they sent a bomb threat through Tor and shut down the campus. But campus IT was able to figure out that there was only one person using Tor connecting to the Tor network at the time that the bomb threat was sent. So Tor is not, right, Tor does one thing, right? It hides your IP address, that's it. It doesn't even hide the fact that you're using Tor. So you have to be careful still, but Secure Drop is about as good as technical solutions are going to get.
But were they able to identify
Yeah, because there was only one person using Tor. So they figured out which computer he was using. He's using a computer on campus, and then they knew who was logged into that computer. Yeah.
Is the MAC address stored in the network packets? Can you see that information as well?
Yeah, so the MAC address is, that is visible in the network traffic from your computer to your access point, right? So when it starts getting routed through firewalls and gateways, there's no more MAC address, because then you see the MAC address of the machine that is forwarding it, right? So the MAC address is the physical Ethernet address.
But your physical address, let's say for your router, right, is exposed?
Generally, the MAC address will not survive transit through the internet.
Okay.
But you can pick it up on Wi-Fi. So that's just getting the documents. And then once you have the documents, you have to worry about whether the documents will reveal the source. Here's one of the famous journalism security fails. Phones and many cameras record the GPS coordinates in metadata on the image. If you publish that image, you know where the phone is. So here's an interview with John McAfee, who was more or less on the run in Belize. And then they knew exactly where he was. One of the famous journalism security failures. This was Vice, by the way. So don't do that. There are programs that will strip metadata from images and other documents. So here's file metadata from a Word document. PDFs have this. Basically, don't ever republish material that was linked to you. Don't ever republish the original files. There's tools that will remove metadata, but one of the safest things you can do is load it up and take a screenshot on your own computer. Then it will have the metadata of your computer and not the source. And the reason I say use a screenshot, because it's truly what you see is what you get. When you take a screenshot, you are literally not getting anything other than what's on the screen, and that's the idea. You want to completely strip all of the information. We learned, unfortunately, in the last few years, everybody learned about microdots. So this is the sad tale of Reality Winner, who was working for the government and forwarded to The Intercept a classified document showing that Russians had gotten into the election websites, not the actual vote counting machines, but the websites of 18 states. Intercept did a story about that. The Intercept published the document. So here's a little more about that.
Sort of like a high-resolution scan.
Yeah, so here's what it is. So basically all printers publish these little dots. You can barely see them here, these little yellow dots. These are called microdots. Yeah, here you go. And they were in the document that they published. And what it gives you is it gives a printer serial number and a date. So if you zoom in here and you invert it, they become blue. You have to increase the contrast a little bit. And you end up with this. And then the EFF website has a little dot decoder. I mean, it's an open standard, right? You don't have to go to the EFF, do it. Oh, look at this. There's all sorts of information about which printers do it or not. Yep, so basically assume everyone. I can't find it right now, but anyway, there's little utilities that will take that microdot image and give you the date and time. And we believe this played a key role in the identification of Reality Winner because all prints are logged. Basically every access to classified material is logged. So, I mean, the fails just stack up here, right? So a source had previously emailed the Intercept, right? So problem number one, there was metadata already showing a contact between them. And we know a lot about how Reality Winner was found because we can read the court documents that the FBI filed, right? So they knew there was a previous contact. They accessed it from work and printed it right? So printer microdocs. And then they sent it to the Intercept. The Intercept then, to verify the document, sent it to someone else in the intelligence services to say, is this real? They sent them the original document, right? That's how the FBI first got a copy of it, right? And then they published the original document, which had the printer microdots and also creases, because Reality Winner had folded it up to take it out. So a major failure on the source's part, a major failure on the journalist part, and Reality Winner is now in jail. Okay, so I think that's all we're going to have time for today. We will end on that cautionary tale.